this computer. So I'm continuing from yesterday, why the Hasidic movement was such a popular movement. I was talking about a lot of difficult times that the Jewish community in the Polish-Lithuanian Empire went through, starting from the massacres of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, 1648 to 1668, the Swedish-Russian War, the Haidamach, or what they call Gaidamak pogroms. There was a whole list of things that I wrote there in Origins of Hasidism, of events that happened during that time until the beginning of the lifetime of the Baal Shem Tov, where the Jewish community felt in despair. And I said you can compare it to what would have happened to the Jewish people if after the Shoah, there would not have been a state of Israel. Because you need some type of ray of light to make you think that not everything is lost. When you lose 1/3 of your people, it looks like everything is lost. And I don't judge Jews who hide being Jewish. There were people in Romania who hid to be Jewish because after the Shoah, under the communists, it wasn't any better. So there are a lot of people who hid being Jewish. Same thing in Poland. Same thing in most of the Warsaw Pact countries. And even in countries like Canada, you had people who came after the Shoah and hid their Jewish identity, even though Canada was a free country after the war. But once that's your mentality, it's very hard to change a mentality. A friend of mine was a rabbi in Krakow for about 7 years. His name is Boaz Pash. He lives in Israel now. And he was a rabbi in Krakow. He was asked to be there, a very small community. They have the elderly are Shoah survivors. They call the children of the Shoah because they were children during the time of the Shoah. And then you have the young people there who are mixed. They call themselves chulent because it's a mixture. So, everybody has some Jews in the family, sort of like, so they call themselves mixture, chulent. Chulent is like a stew, like a Hungarian goulash, where you mix everything together. And so Rabbi Pash told me a story one time where he was asked by one of the gentlemen who was part of this Children of the Shoah organization to come visit him at his house because it was hard for him to walk and he had some questions he wanted to discuss with him. So he said, but Rabbi, I want to tell you one thing. My neighbors don't know that I'm Jewish. So please wear a hat and not a kippah. And your tzitzit, the fringes that you have, if you can tuck it in, okay, not everybody, and you have payot, maybe behind your hat, nobody has to know that I am in touch with the rabbi. He said, okay, he does that. So he goes there with his hat and with his coat, and he crosses on the other side of the Vistula River. He comes to the guy's house, and he looks on the door, and it says, Mr. Goldberg. Yeah, right, like nobody knew that he was Jewish. So people live in this fantasy world, sometimes, but it's just the way that you see, things. And look, again, I never blame people for the fear of an identity. I never blame people for being scared.
Because nowadays with the anti-Semitism, and I even got this question if on the Romanian passport there is written misinformation, the birthplace, because there are the Jewish or the Romanian rules that they can change documents, and having the Romanian passport, they were thinking that by traveling, they won't be detected that they are Jews, they are just Romanians according to the paperwork and to the passport. So there are some questions about how to hide identity, especially with
Well, we have here a champion of civil rights and religious rights, so you can ask her what is going on. She knows the details. Yeah. Okay, so getting back to this. So you need a message sometimes. So the Hasidic movement was the right movement at the right time. As I said, the Baal Shem Tov's message was a little bit different than the message of the movement itself, but he was the inspiration. He was a person who was looking for a direct connection to God. And the Baal Shem Tov's message, or at least the way it was interpreted by his students. Oh, just a sec, I just lost them. Somebody keeps trying to get in and I have to focus how to do it. Wait, they can try again. Tell Laura if she can try again to get in. I didn't see it and I have to hit the right thing here. It's a little complicated. She can try again to get in because I don't see where it went. Or Margolescu, something like that, right? So just to try again, there were two people trying to get in. So as I said, the Baal Shem Tov was somebody who was a very internal type of person, very insular in his world and trying to using techniques for mystical experiences. If you want to say, he was sort of like a Jewish Sufi, right, who was more interested in direct experience with godliness. But his students who were interested in this, like the Bear of Mezrich, like Yaakov Yosef Apolna, the reason they came to him was because they wanted to know what this is and what these techniques are. But what they understood was also the need to create a popular movement for people to give them hope. And the way that they did this was to create a movement that the first thing it did was, and I explained last time, the thinking in Poland, Lithuania at the time was to be close to God, you have to be a scholar. You have to know Torah, you have to know the Bible, you have to know the Talmud, you have to know the Midrash, you have to know Jewish philosophy, you have to know Kabbalah, and then you're a scholar. And because in Judaism there's a very deep belief in scholarship and in learning, so the one who learns the Torah is the one who connects to the word of God. But what about the average person who is not a scholar, who doesn't have the time to spend the day studying Torah and Talmud and has to go work for their living? How does that person become close to God? So the Baal Shem Tov said, if a person can do God's commandments in happiness, if you can be, when you pray, if you pray with intent, with fervor, with emotion, with singing, oh, here it is again. With singing and with dancing, so what this does is it brings you as close to God as the greatest scholars, because God wants the heart. And this was the message of the Hasidic movement. God wants the heart. And I mentioned wants the heart. Wants the heart. Yeah. So this message was the one that, if I would say, sort of like caught on. And because I can pray, I can do a commandment, I do it anyhow. So if I put a little emotion into it, then it brings me to the next level. This was the meaning. Then if you felt unworthy or that you needed guidance, you had the Hasidic leader, the Rebbe, as they called him, or the Tzaddik, which I talked about last time. And they would guide you spiritually. All the Hasidic rabbis were not people who decided Jewish law. They were all spiritual guides.
Somebody is asking that you're saying that you're trying for a few times to join.
I keep hitting on admit all, but she's not in. Keep saying joining.
No.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know even know why it does that. It
Thank
never
you.
does. Yeah, welcome. So, okay, so what
Hello?
was it? Yes, welcome.
About Rabbi. Yes.
Yeah, I lost my train of thought, that's all. As I said, the Hasidic rabbis were not those who decided halacha. They were like guides. I tried to sort of compare it in Orthodox Christianity to the duchovnik, with somebody who was the one who's supposed to be the spiritual guide, not just the one who leads the service in the church. So for instance, the Baal Shem Tov himself was not the rabbi of Medjugorje. There was a rabbi in his city of Medjugorje, but he was somebody who was more a spiritualist and a guide, even a healer they saw him as. So this is part of the Hasidic movement. So what are the issues of the Hasidic movement? What do they try to do? Number one, as it says, this idea of hope, simple faith, and God wants a sincerity in the heart. But then what the Hasidic movement does, it starts creating its own frameworks. So they set up their own synagogues. Usually their synagogues are small, what we call in Yiddish a shtibel. Shtibel is the word stub, which is a house. Shtibel is a little house, and usually you start with a small group. As you know, when you want to have a party and make it successful, you get a room which is a little bit smaller than the amount of people that you invited, and then say, "What's this? It's a success because look at all the people trying to get in." So the shtub, because it's small, you can always fill it up easily, and you become a success. And that's really part of the success of the Hasidic movement, having these small minyanim together with their tzaddik. Secondly, they believe in spreading and going from place to place. There are other things about the Hasidic movement too. So the synagogue, another thing which seems trivial but is not, they have their own nusach. Nusach means the version of the prayer book. You know, in the Jewish prayer book, you have Ashkenaz, where the Jews who lived in France, Germany, and then started going east towards Romania and Hungary and Ukraine and Russia, etc. That we call Ashkenaz. And then you have what's called Sepharad, which is really España, the Jews who were in Spain as early as the 9th century, actually even had a few before there. Under the Visigoths, you still had some Jews there too. And then they eventually go to North Africa and they go through the Ottoman Empire and other places too, and even to Greece, etc. As I said. And then you have others too, but I'm just saying that there were different prayer books. You had the Sephardi prayer book, you had the Ashkenazi prayer book, and you had a prayer book that was influenced by Isaac Luria, the Kabbalist who lived in Safat in the 16th century, and it was known as the Ari, Isaac Luria's version. Now, Isaac Luria in the 16th century, his father was Ashkenaz, and that's why his family name was Luria. Luria is after the river Loire in France. That means the family was from that area. Usually family names before the 19th century were a place or the father. If your name was Davidov, it's because your father was David. If you're Abramovich, your father was Avram. Davidovich, right? So all those things, etc. So, or the Sfaradi would be Ben Moshe, Ben David, right? They would have like the Hebrew, or sometimes also, it would be also in other languages. It could also be a mikzoah. It could also be what the person did as a job. Later on, it became what they did. If your name was Mualim, you were a teacher, right? And in Yiddish, it would be Lerner, it would be the same thing. And in Hebrew, it would be Melamed, teacher. All these are last names based on my last name, Shochet, is one who ritually kills the animals, right? So that's Shochet. But if it was in Russian, it could be Resnik. If it's in Polish, it could be Palevsky. And if it's in Yiddish, it would be Shachter, right? So you also have, occupations that people, and there are many occupations. Gabbai is the one who is in charge of the synagogue, aside from the rabbi. Gabbai is a very popular name in Morocco, for instance. There are many names. You also have names because of your tribe, Cohen. There's a lot of Cohen. There's a Levin, Levinsky. Kagan is Cohen in Russian. Kaganov, right? Kagansky. It's all Cohen. And then you have Segal, Zgan Leviim, the assistant to the Levi. Segal, right? So you have a lot of these type of names too. Then you have, and it goes on and on. Your name could also be Cordovero, because the family came from Cordova. Warshawski, it came from Warsaw. Krakowski, it came from Krakow. And so these things, as I said, go on and on. Now, I went into the names. I have to go back to where we were. So the Nusach. So Isaac Luria's father was Luria because he came from France, and his mother was from those who were expelled from Spain. So his mother was a Sephardic Jew from expelled from Spain. So he himself actually used to pray in a Sephardic synagogue in Sfat. But what he did was he used a little bit from the Ashkenaz, a little bit from the Sfard, and he created his own edition of the Siddur. People who followed the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria used to pray from Isaac Luria's Siddur. This Siddur was known as Nusach Hari, the edition of Isaac Luria. It was also called Sephard. Sephard. In other words, if you had Ashkenaz, and you have Sephardi, it was Sfard. It's not a Sfard, which means it's the Ashkenaz and the Sephardi together, but it's really Isaac Luria's edition. The Chabad here, Lubavitch, they call it the edition of Isaac Luria, Nusach Hari, but all the other Hasidim call it Sfard, but it's more or less the same thing. Now, what was the point of the Hasidim taking that Siddur? The idea is, you think you're just a regular person? No, you're special. You're like the Kabbalists. You can use that special Siddur, because until then, only the Kabbalists use the Siddur, the prayer book of Isaac Luria. But the idea was, no, everybody's special. Everybody's Hasid. Everybody can worship God out of love and not out of obligation. So this was the idea, also creating groups. A person can say, I'm part of that group, right? This is my rabbi. I identify with that rabbi. So this was another thing. They also had their own way of doing shechita, of slaughtering the animals. Because normally we do with a knife. The animal is slaughtered by the jugular vein in one swoop. And they also, when you have shechita, you have two people. You have the shochet, the one who does the slaughtering, and you have the bodek, the one who checks the knife to see that the knife has no dents, no nothing, because it has to be in one swoop. If it's not in one swoop, the animal can't be eaten. When it's done in one swoop, it actually goes very, very quick. It's a matter of seconds until the animal loses any feeling in their body. Now, the Hasidim used to use a double-edged knife that was sharp on both sides. Until then, they used knives that was sharp on one side, because that's all you needed was one side. They started with this thing, and it became a big argument. And the Hasidim only wanted double-edged knives. And so they even had their own people doing shechita. To this day, Chabad, they will only eat meat from a Chabad person who slaughtered the animal, not anybody else. What's the reason for that? No other Jews do it that way, as long as somebody knows what they're doing. This creates your own group. The Hasidic movement also had this idea of creating their own groups, creating loyalty. That might be one of the reasons there was opposition to them, by the way. When you create your own groups, you take people away from the other synagogue. When you only have your own slaughtering, so that means that the guy who's paid by the community, he now gets less money because other people are going to somebody else. Because remember, the community gets paid for the kosher meat because they have to supply the person who supervises and who also does the slaughtering. But if everybody's going to somewhere else, or even a certain part, the community is losing money. So there were infights going on as this was happening. But the message was the message. When something grows, there's always going to be politics. Whether human beings or politics. But you also need people who know how to get over the politics. That's also very important. They are fewer than the politicians. Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to say too much about this, but as I said, in the early years of the Hasidic movement, there was a little bit of an anarchy, because these were groups that were growing like mushrooms after the rain. You say that in Romanian, mushrooms after the rain? Yeah, yeah. And when that happens, there's no control. You have, this was a student of this one, was the student of that one, all over the place. I told you in the 20 years after the death of Baal Shem Tov, there are already over 100,000 Hasidim in Poland. When I say Hasidim, you have to understand there are different levels of what it means to be a Hasid. Today we think of a Hasid, we think of a man who wears this round hat and a black coat and usually black socks or white socks and speaks Yiddish. Of course, you also have Sephardic Hasidim today, but I'm talking about originally. But it wasn't exactly that way. You had different levels of people connected to the Rebbe. Let me give you an example. I always say it's sort of like a football match, soccer, right? So in football, they're the people who go to every game. They buy a ticket because they want to be there in the stadium for every game. Those are the diehard, right? Hardcore sport fans. They have to see it with their own eyes, and they have to wear the shirt, and they have to go like this, right? So that's okay. So that's sort of like the ones who are there, who live next to the Rebbe in his town, and they come definitely every Shabbat, maybe even sometimes during the week. That's the hardcore. But then you have the fans who sometimes go to the soccer game, but most of the time they watch it on television. Okay, they're also fans of the soccer team, but they're not there all the time. And then you have the people who will say, yes, that is my team, whatever, that English soccer team, but I don't always have time to watch it on television. But when there's the big league, the European Cup, then I'm always there to watch it, okay? The same thing in the Hasidic movement. You have the hardcore, they live in the same small town where the Rebbe is, so they can be there every Shabbat. Then you have the people who just feel like you have the Rebbe of Viznitz. So the Rebbe of Viznitz was, I don't know, maybe in Chernovitz, somewhere in Bukovina. And so those people who were very close would live in the same little town, little shtetl, it seems. But you had other people who liked the Rebbe of Viznitz. So they would go for Passover, they would go for Sukkot, they would go for Pentecost. They would go for these times to see the Rebbe, to have a connection. But if somebody said, who is your rabbi? Oh, and then you had those who came every once a year, but they still felt some connection. So this was the Hasidic movement. Not everybody wore the clothing. And even if the ones did, it was usually on Shabbat. I know a fellow who lived in the city of Lodz before the war, where you had a lot of Hasidim. And his family was Hasidic. So I said, did you have the fur hat on Shabbat? What we call the shtreim, or the fur hat? He said, no, because we couldn't afford it. These fur hats were expensive. The average Hasid didn't have money to buy a fur hat. Today, the Hasidim in Brooklyn, they can afford the fur hats, or the ones in Israel, but he said, in our days in Poland, they didn't have money to buy fur hats. So also, the Jews were not allowed to buy the same fur hats that the non-Jews had, which were made out of foxes. They could only buy the fur hat that was made out of fox tails, which was a little bit cheaper, because the real fur hats were supposed to be for the the Polish aristocracy. So they were limited which fur hats they were even allowed to buy. Okay, somebody else is waiting. So all this is talking about the early Hasidic movement. Hasidic movement is a popular movement. It's talking to people. It's drinking a l'chaim, and they would have vodka at the Kiddush because you want people to come. That's really it. I was saying last week in the synagogue I talked in Jerusalem, that even though the Hasidic movement is very liberal in their relationship to alcohol, the truth is that the Jewish sources are quite negative against alcoholism. In last week's Perikopa, I mentioned, where we read about the sons of Aaron who brought an offering which was not allowed. And it says that the fire came out of the heavens and consumed them because they brought an offering in the tabernacle, which was not allowed. So right after that, Moses says to Aaron, you and your sons, when you come into the tabernacle, you are not allowed to come with wine or with beer. which seems to imply that they had been intoxicated at the time that this had happened. And the Midrash, the rabbinic commentaries, are very, very negative about intoxication. So there's a difference between a l'chaim every now and then and intoxication. And it's like I say to people, because you never know who has problems with alcohol, whenever somebody says don't push them. Because you never know who you're talking to. So, yes. Okay. So, but the Hasidic movement did things like this. The Rebbe's Tish, the idea of bringing everybody would come in the evening to the small shtibel, and after they had dinner, they would watch the Rebbe eat. And as he was eating, there would be singing, and there would also be words of Torah, and also stories. This is the time to mention why the Hasidic movement is so involved in storytelling. Today, when we think of a Jewish story, we think of a Hasidic story. But Jewish storytelling goes all the way back to the Bible. And definitely in the Talmud, there are many, many stories. So how did the Hasidic movement get such a central role in Jewish storytelling? There's so many books about Hasidic stories, Elie Wiesel and Martin Buber, etc. There are various collections of Hasidic stories. Aryeh Kaplan, I have to think of the names, but it really goes on and on. And the reason is that the Hasidic movement was a popular movement, and the people don't understand the Kabbalistic ideas that you want to tell them. So even though we're going to read something from the Rabbi of Gur in Poland, that's Gura Kalvaria, the Hasidim of Gur, they start already at the end of the 19th, the middle of the 19th, even the early 19th century. But you can see that some of the ideas are very deep. So it's very possible that the Hasidim listened to these sermons and didn't understand them. But the stories, everybody can understand. So stories are important because everybody can understand a story. In Israel in the 1980s, we had the big immigration of Ethiopian Jews, the Bnei Israel, they were called, from Ethiopia. And when they came to Israel, so they had their own customs, a lot of interesting things. Like I went to visit these young people from Ethiopia who were in a hotel in Beersheba. So it was like 84, I think it was. I was also a young guy at the time. And so I came with some of my friends from yeshiva. And when it came to eating, the men's were at separate tables from the women. Even if they were from the same family, they sat at separate tables from the women. And so we got together with them on Friday night, and we wanted to tell them some things about Shabbat. They didn't seem that interested. Young people, right? And then, so a friend of mine said, tell them stories, because he'd been there before. Okay, so I said them, because Hebrew they picked up very quickly. I said, now I'm going to tell a story. Once I said I'm going to tell a story, it was like Moses at Sinai. You could hear a pin drop. They just stood there because that's the way they were taught. When their rabbis would teach them, we teach everything as a story. Sit there, they weren't allowed to say a word. It's very, very interesting to see that behavior pattern, that's the way they were taught their traditions. So, but usually stories are popular, which means you tell a story. Somebody hears the story and it sounds okay, but sometimes the story has a meaning and it makes you think. This is the idea of the Hasidic story, the meaning, to make you think about what the meaning of the story is. I will give you an example of a Hasidic story, okay? And these examples are this is an example of a Hasidic story told by Isaac Leib Peretz. Isaac Leib Peretz was a Yiddish and Hebrew writer who lived in Odessa in the 19th century. He was a Jew who came from a very religious family, but became involved in what's called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. But he has a book he wrote in Hebrew called Hasidut, and it's all about stories. And two of the stories have become very popular. One of them is called if not higher. So I'll tell that story now. It's called If Not Higher. Okay, you people can hear me? Okay. But when we actually talk on Thursday, probably more about stories, I'll show you some stories online, which were actually acted out. There is stories of Nachman Breslov, which were acted out, put together by an Israeli producer. And I use that in a course that I teach in Israel on Nachman Breslov's stories. His stories are actually a different type of story, but I'll talk about that another time. So the story goes like this. The story is that it's the month of Elul, which is the last Hebrew month, right before the New Year's. And in the month of Elul, the Ashkenazic Jews, 1 week before New Year's, they read the penitential prayer early in the morning. The Sephardim, they start from the beginning of the month of Elul, 30 days before New Year's, and they do in the middle of the night. They read the penitential prayer, where we ask for forgiveness every night. And they also say the 13 attributes of mercy, which God told Moses on the mountain at Sinai. And the story was that the rabbi, Moshe Leib of Sassov, I'm giving you the way it's told by Elie Wiesel in his book, Souls on Fire. So he says Moshe Leib of Sassov was the rabbi in this community. And he wasn't there for the early morning penitential prayer. In fact, by the time he would get to the synagogue, it was already 9:30 and the prayers were all over. So the people, the Hasidim, would all get together in the market and they would discuss among themselves, where did the rabbi go? I mean, this is the time for more prayers and to beseech God for forgiveness. Why does he disappear? Where does he go? So the first one said, oh, obviously our rabbi knows that there are evil decrees waiting to be sent to the Jewish people. So at night he does special techniques, goes up to heaven and beseeches the heaven to destroy these decrees. Until he comes down, takes a long time, and then by 9:30 he comes to the synagogue. So he said, okay, that sounds right. Well, there was this one guy, he was an opponent of the Hasidic movement, what we call the mitnagdim, or in Yiddish, misnagdim, the ones who didn't like the Hasidic. They usually wear round glasses and have like a goatee. And so this guy, he said, that's not possible. He can't just go up to heaven. I'm going to find out where the rabbi goes at night and find out the real story. So he tells his wife, he can't do that. It's not right. He says, I have to find out. So at 8 o'clock, he goes to the rabbi's house, and a lot of people are talking to the rabbi in the living room. So while they're talking to him in the living room, shalom, welcome. Bienvenue. So yes, please, Olivia, yes. So while the rabbi is in the salon, so the opponent goes into the rabbi's bedroom and gets under the bed to stay there and wait to see what's going to happen. So he's under the bed. It's now 10 o'clock and people are leaving the house. And the rabbi now goes to his room to go to sleep. So he puts on his pajamas, jumps into the bed, and the opponent is under the bed. And he's getting a little nervous. He's under the rabbi's bed, but I have to find out where he goes. Okay, the rabbi goes to sleep, the opponent goes to sleep. And it's now 3 o'clock in the morning, and he hears the rabbi get up. The rabbi gets up, jumps out, goes in the washroom, puts on his clothes, comes back, and the opponent's ready to walk after him, but he can't let the rabbi know he's under the bed. So the rabbi goes into the closet, and he takes out a big coat. Is a coat. A coat.
Yes.
And puts it on him. And he also takes a big axe. How do you say an axe? Yeah, a big axe, like when you chop trees. And he puts it into his bag. And the mitnagid, the opponent, is under the bed. He's thinking, what is this? Is the rabbi's secret that during the day he's a rabbi and at night he's a criminal with a big axe? What's going on? Then the rabbi leaves. When the rabbi leaves, so the opponent gets out from under the bed and he creeps behind him, but he stays a distance so that nobody knows that he's behind. And the rabbi walks out into the forest, which is behind the house. And he walks out of the forest and he gets to a tree. And he takes out the axe and he starts chopping the tree. And the tree falls down. And then he cuts off as many branches as he can. And he takes his big sack and he fills up the sack with the wood and puts it over his right shoulder and starts walking towards the town. While he's walking towards the town, it's now 5 o'clock in the morning. He is saying the words of the penitential prayer in his as he's walking. So he comes to the first house and he knocks on the door. And this old lady says, "Hello, who is it?" Says, "My name is Vasily, and I have wood." Says, "Vasily, I don't have any money to pay you." He opens up the door and walks in. Says, money, you'll pay me later. So he says, "What do you want?" He says, "You have an oven. I brought you wood for the oven." So he starts putting the wood in the oven. Says, "But I don't have any money to pay you. You have belief in God. I have belief. You'll pay me one day." So he starts putting and as he's putting the wood into the oven, he's continuing the penitential prayer, murmuring with his lips. He finishes there. He goes to the next house, knocks on the door. The old man says, "Who is it?" Says, "Vasily, I sell wood." Says, "I don't have money." Opens up the door, same thing, starts putting it in. Says, "Eventually you'll pay me." He does this 5, 6, 7 different houses until all the wood is gone. Then he goes back home. The whole time the opponent's like, "Can't believe what's going on. I mean, this is what he done." And then he goes back to the house, puts the coat into the closet, the axe back in the closet, puts on his regular clothes, and walks towards the synagogue. Now it's 9:30 in the morning, and the Hasidim are all gathered in the town square. And the first Chassid says, "Where did the Rebbe go last night? Why again? Every night he's not here for the penitential prayer in the morning." So one of the Hasidim says, "Look, you have to understand, the Rebbe has special powers. And he goes up to the heaven because he has to pray against the decrees that might happen against the Jewish people." Everybody agrees. And then the mitnaged is there, the opponent says, "I know where the Rebbe went." And they say, "Really? You know?" He says, "Yes." He says, "Are we right? Does he go up to heaven?" He says, "Maybe even higher." It's a famous story. It's like late parents. But here you have a story. There are 2 types of Hasidic stories. Today, if you read Hasidic stories which are told by Chabad in their Perik Papa sheets that come out every Friday, it's usually about some amazing miracle that was done by some Rebbe. Okay? These are stories which are not about miracles. It's about human beings who become the miracle themselves by transforming themselves into better human beings. A lot of the early Hasidic stories are like that. A lot of the early Hasidic stories about the Baal Shem Tov, told by the Rebbe's, are how you can make yourself a better person, a more spiritual person, what you can do in your life. Later on, 2nd and 3rd generation become stories about the rabbis themselves, which also very often have meanings too. But I'm just saying, it just changes a little bit as things go down the line. They say about the Baal Shem Tov, they say the Baal Shem Tov once said that anybody who believes everything they say about me is naive. But anybody who believes that it cannot happen is a heretic. Means it could happen, but it didn't necessarily happen that way. That's what it means, right? You have to have belief, but it doesn't mean that you have to be naive. So, okay, so that story I wanted to mention, the stories themselves are things that people remember. And as I said, when it came to other things like the Dvar Torahs of the Hasidim and the sermons that they gave in their small synagogues, some people would understand them, some wouldn't. Some would understand parts and some wouldn't. It's like I told you this story. There was this rabbi in Montreal who was a conservative rabbi, and then he became Chabad. So he became Orthodox and became Chabad. So I met him one time. I said, "Do you go to the classes on Tanya, which is one of the books of Shneur Zalman Ladi and Chabad, their version of Kabbalah?" He said, "Yeah, I go to the classes." I said, do you understand them? He says, by the third l'chaim, by the third drink, I think I get it. So what happens, in other words, not everybody gets exactly, but they get the environment of these things. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about in a nutshell. What is the Hasidic movement and why is there opposition? I want to talk a little bit about the opposition. There's a book by a researcher called Walensky, a book that was written at the beginning of the middle of the 20th century, Mordechai Walensky. He talks a lot about the history of the arguments back and forth between the Hasidim and their opposition. The opposition to the Hasidim begins in Lithuania, meaning the northern part of Poland. And a lot of it is inspired by the group which is close to the Vilna Gaon, Elijah ben Shlomo Zalman, who lived from 1720 till 1797. I did a lot of research on. Again, the early Hasidic movement was considered a popular movement by everybody, but not necessarily a heretical. You know, there's a lot of leeway in Judaism. In general, in Judaism, there were not a lot of holy wars against other people. In Christianity, the Catholics and the Protestants fought in France for years. Is the Trinity like this? Is it like that? You know, so, or the Orthodox and the Catholics about the icons. Are you allowed to have an icon or just a picture? And so, I mean, there were reasons for people to fight. In Judaism, because for 2,000 years we lived in the exile, and Jews had to stick together. So as long as somebody kept the Sabbath and kept kosher, what did it matter what they thought? Okay, so they don't get it right, big deal, but at least they do what everybody else is doing. So there was a lot of tolerance for different positions of thought among Judaism. In the 12th century, Maimonides, for instance, writes in his book, The Laws of Penitence, that a Jew is not allowed to believe that God has a corporeal form, a body, because philosophically it makes no sense. God is infinite. How can he have a body? Bodies are things which are finite, not infinite. You can't have an infinite body. But so there, Maimonides says that this is heretical. If somebody thinks that God has a body, it's a terrible thing, and they have to ask forgiveness on Yom Kippur for such a thought. Maimonides is attacked by two people. One of them is Avraham ben David of Poskir, who lived at the same time. And there are others too, Joseph Albo, who lived in Spain 100 years later, 150 years later. But the attacks were all the same. Basically, the position of Albo is, why do you call a person like that a heretic? Because they didn't study philosophy and they don't understand that God can't have a body, they're a heretic. Doesn't it say in the Bible, the hand of God, the eyes of God? Doesn't Moses say to Pharaoh, the hand of God will smite your cattle when he talks about the plagues? Doesn't it say in the prophets that God's feet, one will be on the Mount of Olives and the other one will be on Mount Zion? Doesn't God say through Isaiah, the heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool? So it's understandable that people think that God has a body. They're wrong, but they're not sinners. Okay, so the argument was, just because you have it wrong, is that a sin? Because all you're doing is reading the text of the Bible, understanding it according to its simple meaning. The philosophers will say this is a metaphor, but the simple people, of course, they'll have that problem. That's just obvious. So I'm just giving you an example of things that of how you can have something. When it came to ideas, Jews were very tolerant with ideas normally. That's why Maimonides' fight against anthropomorphism, for instance, is almost unique because people usually were more laissez-faire when it came to tolerating different points of view. Maimonides put his foot down on that and said, no, this is too much. And basically he won, because after that, everybody basically towed the line of Maimonides, that anything anthropomorphic is wrong, but not everybody was willing to use the term sin. Because again, it's problematic. Simple people don't always get it. So sometimes you have to give them a little bit of leeway, a little bit of flexibility. So that's why the Hasidic movement, even if they said things that sometimes were different than what the opposition said, there was a certain amount of leeway. And I'll give you examples. Based on the Zohar, Book of Splendor, which was which came out originally around 1275 to 1280 in Castilla by Moses de Leon, and it's ascribed to Shimon Bar Yochai from the 2nd century. So the Zohar says that God permeates all and surrounds all. Sovev kol almin umemale kol almin. God permeates everything and surrounds everything. Velet atar panui minei. There is no place devoid of godliness. God is everywhere and in everything. God is actually, if you want to put it this way, the real reality. God is the real reality. It's interesting that at the same time, by the way, not the same. Okay, it's interesting. You have, like, for instance, in the Islamic philosophic group called the Mutakalim, the Kalam of the 8th to 10th century in Babylonia. So they have a discussion. Also, they have this belief that God is everywhere, and they have this discussion: does God create everything in every second? Almost like the Buddhists have this idea. Is God constantly creating the world every second? Because if God is everywhere and God is the real reality, maybe the reality that we see is being created at every moment. These are ideas. They had an idea of atoms and God creating every atom at every moment. So this was ideas of the Kalam, in the speakers, the Kalam. And but in the Kabbalistic literature, especially from the time of the Zohar, this becomes a very basic idea. God permeates everything, God surrounds everything, and everything is godliness. The problem is that if you're going to teach somebody that God is everywhere, it creates a problem with Jewish law. Because in Jewish law, we believe there are places which are holy, like the temple, like the synagogue. These places are more holy, right? Then you have places which are what we call impure, like a cemetery. It's called an area of impurity. Then you have places which are unclean, like a bathroom, a toileta. Then you have places which are just regular, everything else, chulin, right? They're just regular. So you have at least 4 categories in Jewish law. Things which are kadosh, which are holy. Things which are impure, the opposite, which are unholy, like a cemetery. There are also animals which are pure and animals which are impure. The ones we're allowed to eat are called pure. The ones we're not allowed to eat are called impure. And in the Torah and Leviticus and last week's Perikopa. And then you have places which are unclean, as I said, like a lavatory, like a toilet, and places, then just regular places. Now, I cannot study Torah in a place which is unclean. A Kohen, a priest, who is supposed to go into the temple, they're not allowed to go into a cemetery which is impure. I can't eat an animal which is impure. Now, if you're going to say that God is everywhere, so why can't I study Torah in the toilet? God's in the toilet. Right? Everywhere. You said everywhere. God's in the cemetery, so why is it impure? You say God's not in the cemetery? You just said God's everywhere. So Chaim Volozhin, one of the disciples of Vilna Gaon, said, it's not that I'm disagreeing with what the Zohar said, but it's not a good idea to teach this to everybody, because not everybody's going to understand what that means. We live in a world where there are categories. There's a hierarchy. There are things which are holy. There are places which are impure. There are places which are unclean. And then there's everything else. We have these categories, and that's how we live. Even if from God's point of view, the categories might not exist. But we live in a world where from our point of view, they do, and there's a reason why. God created us to see these categories in a certain way and told us, live by the categories. So I can't pretend that I'm God looking from his perspective. That was the argument. It's a very interesting argument in a book called Nefesh HaChaim by Chaim Volozhin, which was written in 1832, I think it was published for the first time, 1823. And this was an argument, a philosophical argument with Hasidim. Again, and the argument is very interesting. He doesn't say he disagrees. He says, from our perspective, this is wrong. And it's not a good idea always to teach God's perspective because we don't really understand what that means. So it's not good to pretend. If you're a Kabbalist, you can say that. But for more people, most people, they won't understand what you're talking about. So better not to teach that. This was one of the arguments, this idea that God is everywhere, which the Hasidic movement taught very openly. Also, the idea that everybody really should be studying the secrets of the Torah. Whereas the opponent said, not everybody. It depends who. So some people, yes. And some people, there are other things they should be studying because they're not there. It's not for them. You know, they used to say that a person would study the Zohar and become crazy. So there was a Kabbalistic rabbi from Algeria. His name was Leon Ashkenazi, Rabbi Leon Ashkenazi. He used to say, the people who studied the Zohar who became crazy, they were crazy before they studied the Zohar. It wasn't the Zohar that made them crazy. They just, yeah. That's why I always say that, that there are no radical ideologies, because ideologies, they're only radical psychologies. If you take a radical person, every ideology they'll see as radical. If you take a moderate person, every ideology they'll see as moderate. So I always say that extremism it's not an ideology, it's a psychology. So, getting back to this, so there was another argument, which is exactly the tone, with aside from this, a philosophical argument. There was an account about God being everywhere. Do I teach that? Do I teach that God is everywhere? Is it worth it? What do I gain by it? By teaching that God. Another thing. In the Hasidic world, another one of the arguments was, if I have to pray to God and I want to do it with the right intent, because that's what the Hasidim say. Normally in Judaism, you pray the morning prayer in the morning, from the time the sun rises until what's called the 4th hour of the morning. So now summertime, it's quite late. It's about 10:30 because the sun rises later and the day is longer. That's what we call temporal hours, where you take the sunlight and you divide it into 12 parts. It's not exactly hours on the clock. In the winter, it's shorter. In the summer, it's longer. And in Kriyat Shema, the saying of Shema until the 3rd hour, we have times that you're allowed to do the morning. If you're stuck and you have to do it all morning, that's okay. But it's supposed to be a certain time. The afternoon prayers in the afternoon until the sun sets. The evening prayers at night.
Where did that start?
It's mentioned for the first time in the Mishnah, which is the end of the Second Temple period. So that means that remember also that the prayers take the place of the temple service. So even though people prayed when there was a temple, probably the idea of 3 times a day began with the destruction of the temple. And then it becomes instead of the sacrificial service. Because then you had the Olat HaBoker, the sacrifice brought exactly when the sun rose. Then then you had the afternoon sacrifice, Olat and it was basically in the afternoon. And then and then in the evening, the leftovers of that sacrifice would be burning the whole night in the temple. So those became the three. Later, they said it's because of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham becomes the morning, Isaac is the afternoon, Jacob is the night. There's reasons for it, but that's also discussed in the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, and the Tractate of Brachot, of blessings. So, so the Hasidim, so the question was, let's say it's the morning, it's 9 o'clock, but I'm not in the mood. And the rabbi's not here. I need the rabbi to be. He's my spiritual guide. Okay, so the Hasidim, where is he going? Wait for the rabbi to go. And now it's 11 o'clock. He's still not here. Okay, you wait a little bit more. So sometimes Shacharit, the morning service would be in the afternoon service would be at night. It's got a little bit haywire. Because for the Hasidim, the most important thing was the intent. The time, who cares about the time? This was actually a very big fight. It seems trivial, but it was a major fight because it was the first breach of Jewish law. And even though it seems like a trivial thing, for the opponents, this was a slippery slope. You breach Jewish law. And one thing, who knows what you're going to do tomorrow? The Reform movement, by the way, which started in somewhere around 1818 in places like Hamburg and Berlin, the first things that they did was remove the Aramaic from the Jewish prayer book. Okay, so you think, how many prayers are there in Aramaic? 3. Big deal. And then they brought in the organ, and then they took out all mention of the Messianism and the revival of the dead in the land of Israel, and all of a sudden the whole prayer book started. But you always start with something small. So there was a real fear that the Hasidic movement was going to become a sort of a reform movement. If you can tell people that you can pray in the afternoon, the morning service, and the afternoon service at night, then what's going to happen after that? What will be the next step? The opposition to the Hasidic movement became very fierce in Lithuania. I hate talking about the opposition before we talked about the sources, but once I'm talking about it and we only have 4 meetings, I have no choice. But because, the opposition of the Hasidic movements is in 3, let's say 2 editions. The first one is in 1770. Remember, the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760. 1772 is the first attempt to put a ban against the Hasidim, excommunication ban. Now, in Judaism, there is no official excommunication. It's not like the church, you can say this person is not a Christian anymore. We don't really have that concept, because if you're born a Jew, you're a Jew. It doesn't, you can't get rid of a person. In fact, even if you convert to Judaism, you're stuck. If you converted to Judaism and on the day of your conversion, you were honest, you were stuck. You would have to prove that you weren't honest on the day of your conversion to get out of it. And you would have to have good proofs, because then Jewish law basically decides that it, I always say to people when they want to convert, I say, think about this twice, It's like Maimonides says, you say to a potential convert, remember, before that you were Jewish, you can do whatever you want on the Sabbath. You can turn on lights, you can take the car, it's not a problem. But once you become Jewish, you have to follow all the regulations of the Sabbath. Before you were Jewish, you want to eat pork, not a problem. But you become Jewish, it's a problem. So think about it twice. If you really want to do this and have these regulations and restrictions. So the joke about this man comes to the rabbi in Yom Kippur, says, Rabbi, I need to confess something and I need your help. The rabbi says, well, what do you need to confess? We don't do confession. You do that for God. I just need guidance. Okay, guidance I can give you. Says, what's the problem? Says, I went to this restaurant and I ate bread and I didn't wash my hands before eating the bread. What do I do? I said, well, the next time you eat bread, you wash your hands with the blessing before the bread. Says, thank you. Okay, no problem. But tell me something. Why didn't you wash your hands before the bread and say the blessing? What's the big deal? Well, Rabbi, what can I tell you? I wanted to do that, but it wasn't a kosher restaurant, so I didn't think it was appropriate. I see. And I was like, well, why didn't you go to a kosher restaurant then? where it would be more appropriate. Rabbi, I wanted to, but they were all closed because it was Yom Kippur. So sometimes I always say that sometimes a person wants to say something, but they don't know how to say it, so they start with a little thing. Yeah. Oh, wait, somebody's saying something here, I think. No? Oh, I thought something.
Olympia, the mute.
Oh, I thought you answered. Hi. Okay.
Well, I was thinking if you
Sorry.
need to go to Judaism and during the process, like, because I know it's not so short to process, if they change their mind and they ever told you, like, I was thinking twice and I want to go, like.
If a person was sincere on the day of conversion from a Jewish point of view, they're always Jewish. What they do with it, look, you have a lot of people who are Jewish and they just disappear into the world of assimilation and you never see them again.
After 3 months, what happened to you to tell you?
Look, if you're talking about the process doesn't mean anything. It's the day that you stand before the Beit Din and then they send you to the mikveh. That's the end of the process matters.
During the process, did they change their minds? It's possible. to change their
Yeah. It usually happens within the first month. Yeah, that's why it's good to raise the bar at the beginning so people realize, I always say when it comes to conversion, if somebody converts and they're not serious, it's making fun of all the people who are. That's why it's not right. I know there are a lot of people I know in Israel say, we have to be more lenient about conversion. No, because you have to respect the people who converted for the real reason. And if you have people and you're more lenient and they don't mean it, then these people who are very sincere, everybody will think they were also not sincere. I get this so much, that's why we have a fellow who converted in Tel Aviv. Very, very, all of them are interesting stories. This guy, the family was from Italy. His mother was a Roma from Italy. And his father was an Israeli Jew who he never met. I guess they had like a very short relationship. And his father didn't want to know him. So he had to find out that his father was.
Maybe it's not true.
Maybe, but I think it probably is. So anyhow, and what does it matter anyhow? You can convert if you had a Jewish father or not, right? So this was the story. And then when he became interested in Judaism, he moved to Belgium and lived with Hasidim in Antwerp for years, okay, to study Judaism. And very interesting fellow. He knows all these, he also lived, by the way, here in Romania. He lived in Cluj for like 5 years. So he speaks a perfect Romanian. And he was married to a woman who was a Roma, also a gypsy. And they have a child. And he wanted to bring up the child Jewish, but the mother didn't. And the mother's somewhere in Europe and he came to Israel. Anyhow, eventually, so he wanted to convert to Judaism and it was and he did it, but it was an uphill battle, but he eventually did it. So it's very interesting. And he will show me one time all these things that he has from a great grandmother, which was actually on his mother's side also, who happened to be Jewish. All these Sabbath cups, in Ivrit, which were from Warsaw. So he also on his mother's side had some Jews in the family too. He even had one who was in the Shoah. And he showed me the certificate that she had from the Nazis, whatever, like crazy stuff. So you never know, like people, yeah, there's a lot of very interesting people on this earth, and we all go through great, unusual experiences.
But you told us such an interesting idea that who knows these people were maybe there are souls which converted.
Yeah, and sometimes the biggest anti-Semites are Jews. Turns out that they were Jewish. They also have that. Torquemada had Jewish roots, who expelled the Jews from Spain. Yeah, we have that problem. I call that the Stockholm syndrome. It's like a psychological syndrome when, remember, Jews have been persecuted for years and years and years. So it's surprising that there's any Jew that's normal at this point, and you're that, so yeah, but what can you do? Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so there were some there were some philosophical issues with the Hasidim, the idea of praying at the wrong time, which became a very popular issue at the time. That you shouldn't pray at the wrong time, you should pray at the right time. Even today, by the way, even though the Hasidim have towed the line ever since the opposition was against them, but they still, if you want to get a very late service on Shabbat morning, you go to the Hasidic area either in Mea Shearim or in Bnei Brak, and you'll always find an 11 o'clock service if you're looking for a late one. They still have the groups who do things very late, but they don't break the rubric. They won't do it in the afternoon anymore. But they'll still be a little bit lenient and flexible with the times. So in 1772, there is a movement trying to stop the Hasidic movement in Lithuania. It is spearheaded by the town of Vilna, where the Vilna Gaon lives. And he signs the edict calling to ban the Hasidic movement, not allow them to join our synagogues. Of course, that's not a problem for them because they had their own synagogues. But it was more of like this idea and to cut them off. And they tried to get all the Jewish communities in Lithuania to agree. And what happened was, so for instance, one of the places was the city of Brod. The city of Brod also, I think Brod was in northern Poland, just on the border with Lithuania. Now the city of Brod wasn't sure if they wanted to sign the ban, but what they did was they made their own ban, and they said it's wrong for the Hasidim to pray from the prayer book of the Isaac Luria, what I call the Sfard. They shouldn't pray because that's only for Kabbalists. That's all they wrote. They didn't talk about anything else. In other words, this is just for Kabbalists, it's not, and it's wrong, and that's why we're writing this ban. In other words, they didn't take it that serious. So the town of Vilna did, but the other towns, there were about 5 other towns, didn't take it so seriously. And even in the ban of the town of Vilna, most of the rabbis didn't sign. It was still at a point where people didn't think the Hasidic movement was such a large movement and mattered that much. So whatever happened in 1772 was a very minor ban of the Hasidim, and not everybody agreed. And not only that, you had Hasidic rabbis who had communities in Lithuania. For instance, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who is 3rd generation Hasidic rabbi, 2nd generation really, I should say, a student of the Maggid HaMizmich. He had his own synagogue in Lithuania where he was the rabbi, even though he was a Hasidic rabbi, right in the bastion of the opposition, right, the center of the opposition in Lithuania. So it shows that in those days, in the 1770s, the opposition to Hasidism was very minor. However, the late Ada Rappaport was a researcher of Hasidism. She was Israeli living in England. And she wrote an article showing that the Hasidic movement was not a movement at the beginning. It was too haphazard. It was not orderly. They never met with each other. You can't have a movement when the leaders never talk to each other. There were the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, the disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich, and the disciples of Yaakov Yosef of Polna and other people, but they just did their own thing. The only thing that united them is the fact they saw themselves as continuing the line of the Baal Shem Tov, Israel Baal Shem Tov, but they were not unified as a movement, which had uniform ideas. They were definitely not monolithic. What happened was, with the first ban against the Hasidim in 1772, the Hasidim realized they have to get together and decide how they're going to present themselves. So the ban created the Hasidic movement. Because once you have a ban, you have to get together, all the leaders of the Hasidic communities, and they had to discuss, what are we going to do against the ban? So it's basically the ban against the Hasidic movement, which created the Hasidic movement. Now remember, in the early Hasidic world, there were unusual things. For instance, there were somersaults in the synagogue. The idea of the somersault was bringing the heavens to the earth, your head to the feet. So they would actually do somersaults sometimes in the synagogue as a symbol of heaven to earth and earth to heaven. That stopped after the first generation. And there were other things too, but so some of those things stopped. The second ban against the Hasidim was in 1781. This already was a much more serious ban. The question is why in 1781? Some people say because by 1781 and even by 1772, there used to be what was called the Jewish leaders of the four counties. Vad Arba Aratzon, the leaders of the four counties. The four counties, if I remember correctly, was Lithuania, large Lithuania, was Poland, don't remember all the areas, maybe Belarus, all these areas around Greater Poland was called the Council of the Four states, Arba Medinot. This council was disbanded by the Polish government in 1764. According to some of the historians, that enabled the Hasidic movement to flourish, because if there would have been a council, they would have had got permission from the council, which would have made things much more difficult. The breakdown of the council opened up, we say in English, when the cat's away, the mice will play. So yeah. The second thing that happened was that in 1781, the Hasidim published the first book of Hasidic thought. Yaakov Yosef of Polna put out the first Hasidic book with ideas from the Baal Shem Tov, and it was called Toldot Yaakov Yosef. And his name, of course, is said.
Excuse me, can you repeat?
Toldot Yaakov Yosef was the name of the book. It was put out by Jacob Joseph of Polna, who was a direct student of the Baal Shem Tov. This was the first published Hasidic work. Together with this work also was that famous letter of the Baal Shem Tov to his brother-in-law, which I mentioned last week. Because this was the first work, in my opinion, this was a reason for a ban. Because until now, the Hasidim were just a movement, but they had no literature. And books, they all of a sudden, when they become literature, they become part of Jewish literary history. Because books were taken very seriously. And the question was, do we let the Hasidim, who are now publishing books, become an official part of the history, of the religious history of the Jewish people? And there are those who thought not in Lithuania. Problem number two, and this is a problem which I discovered, but I didn't see other people saying it. Poland was partitioned 3 times. The first partition of Poland is in 1772. That's the first partition of Poland. How does the partition happen? The Russians come, just like they did to Ukraine. In fact, it is part of Ukraine, so, but it wasn't called Ukraine in those days. And they decided to take part of Poland. And the Prussians, from the other side, took another part of Poland. That was in 1772. The ban against the Hasidim, the first ban in 1772, was about 3 to 5 months before the actual first partition of Poland. In my opinion, what was going on here is there was a fear that the Hasidim would have to move west and that Lithuania would be full with Hasidim. So we have to act quickly before they take over our communities too, and not just the other parts of Poland. The second partition of Poland is around 1781. Which again was also part of this fear. The third partition of Poland is 1797, but that's much later. But in my opinion, one of the bans also coincided to a certain point, to a certain amount, with the partitions of Poland, because of the fear that the Jewish communities would basically be totally taken over with Hasidim. In any event, the second ban of 1781 is a very serious ban. Not only is the Vilna Gaon signed on it, all the rabbis of Vilna, rabbis abroad, the 5 major towns which were close to Lithuania, they were all on board with this. the idea to slow down what's going on with Hasidic movement. It didn't work in the end. If anything, the opposition to the Hasidic movement kept them within the fold, kept them from breaking the red lines of Jewish law. That it did prevent. That's why today, when we think of Hasidim, we think of Orthodox Jews. It doesn't occur to us that they started off as a sort of reform movement. Not reform the way we know it today. Remember, there was no secularism in the 18th century. So it was not reform in the way we know today. But it was, I said, maybe like charismatic Christianity. And I'm sure if you ask a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian about charismatic Christianity looks good, right? In other words, so everybody looks at the other one who's trying to do something differently as being different. So the opposition had real reasons. The Hasidic movement was creating its own establishments, its own synagogues, its own way of kosher meat, its own. There was reasons for this. On the other hand, their success was getting to the simple person, and that was an important thing. The fights between the opposition, the Hasidim, went on for probably until the early 19th century, into the 1800s. There were still fights. The fierce fights only happened in the first 20 years, until about 1790. After that, the fights were more ideological than actual. What do I mean by actual? There were actual fights. This one would tattletale to the government, and the Hasidim are doing things and they're not good citizens. And then the Hasidim would tattletale on the opposition, they're not good citizens. So there would be problems. You had rabbis who were arrested by the Russians, and we have the documentation in French, because the Russians, all their documents were in French at that time, which is interesting. And where they arrested the Vilna Gaon, and they arrested Shneur Zalman of Vladi, of Lubavitch. They have the Hasidim, they make a special celebration when he came out. Twice he was arrested, twice he came out. And there's a whole interview with him. Why do the rabbis in Lithuania like you? What are the Hasidim? And they asked Shneur Zalman of Vladi, who was the founder of Chabad Hasidim, tell us what it is, which is very interesting to ask somebody so at the beginning, tell us what it is. And he's explaining it to these French-speaking Russian policemen investigating him, trying to explain what it is and why those guys don't like them. Okay. So there was a fellow by the name of Munstein who wrote a whole book about all these collections of these interviews and investigations. So that's a little bit about the opposition of the Hasidim and Minagdim. Okay. At this point, I'll tell another story. Okay, because that way people don't fall asleep. Another way is by the caffeine in the Coca-Cola. You're not falling asleep. So the story goes, this is a much later story, because in storytelling among the Hasidim, you have the early stories and you have the later stories. Because remember, even to this day, there are rabbis in the Hasidic world. But unfortunately, the stories that are told today very often, they're, this miracle, that miracle. There's a Hasidic rabbi who wrote a commentary on the Bible called Ma'or V'Shemesh. He was actually a student of the Baal Shem Tov directly. And Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, I have to check. Clonimus Kalman. And so he said, when he's writing about the false prophets in Deuteronomy, there's two places about false prophets. And it says a false prophet who brings you a miracle, don't listen to them because they want to bring you off to idol worship, whatever. So he says, nowadays, he says, everybody wants to go to the rabbis who do the miracle. He says, but that's not what a rabbi is. And this is a Hasidic rabbi. He says, you don't go to a rabbi to do miracles. You go to a rabbi because you want spiritual guidance. That's the real rabbi. It's not the miracles. And when you realize that somebody understands the world and they can guide you, that's your rabbi. What does it matter? Why does he have to do a miracle? I'm going to quote Simcha Bunim Fashiska. Simcha Bunim Fashiska was a Polish rabbi who was a student of the Chose, the seer of Lublin. Seer of Lublin. That's the Seer of Lublin is a Talmud of the Maggid of Mezrich. She's a student of the Maggid of Mezrich. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. And Fashischa was a very rational Hasidic movement. They believed in elitism. They didn't like the popularization of the Hasidic movement. They thought it should be specific, unique people who are worthy. Why are we teaching it to everybody? It was like a sort of like backlash against the popularism, because the Chozeh, the Seer of Lublin, was very much into popularizing Hasidism in Western Poland. And so some of his students didn't like that. And Simcha Bunim of Fashischa, and also the Yaakov Yitzchak of Fashischa, who was called the Holy Jew, Yehudi Kadosh, and Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. All these were believed in more of an elitism. So Simcha Bunim is quoted as saying, the truth is, he said, I have the ability to revive the dead, but I really prefer to revive the living. It's much more interesting. That's a lot of work. Yeah. So what can I say? Okay, I'll tell you, where should I go at this point? You know what? No, I'm not going to tell another story today. I just want to tell you one idea, maybe to try to understand the Hasidic world. But to tell you an idea, I have to explain the Hasidic world. So I'll leave that for tomorrow. By the way, tomorrow we meet again at 4. I discovered that my test is on Thursday, not tomorrow. I keep getting that mixed up. So from 4 to 6 tomorrow. So I'll tell you another story. Do you want a late story or an old story? Meaning, do you want 20th century?
Old,
Oh,
old.
okay. I'll start with the Seer of Lublin. Seer of Lublin, this one. Okay, Chozeh Lublin, I just mentioned the Chozeh. And remember the story, the way it's told. Okay, the Seer of Lublin, as I said, popularized Hasidism in Western Poland, because it started in Eastern Poland, the areas of the Ukraine. Story goes that the Seer was very poor. And one Friday, his wife was looking for money to buy Sabbath candles. She didn't have it. It was bad, you know. She went to the shop, she bought some chicken legs for the soup. That's all she could afford, but she didn't have any money for the candles. She wondered what to do. And there was one Jew in the town who was quite wealthy in the little town of Lublin. And he was not the most observant type of person. He was a businessman, whatever. And she went out looking for people who could possibly help her for a couple of coins to buy some candles for Shabbat. Because, you know, okay, it's beneath her dignity for her to ask for money, but a few coins, maybe it doesn't matter. So anyhow, so all of a sudden this guy with his horses and his carriage is driving by. And he sees this lady sitting with a little sign, I need a few pennies for Sabbath candles. And he stops and says, how much do you need? He says, it would be a big favor if you had 5 pennies for me so I could buy the Sabbath candles. If that's all you need, 5 pennies. Take the 5 pennies. So he drops 5 pennies into her little cup. She says, I don't know if I'll be able to pay you back, but I want to bless you that your soul be able to touch the level of the Garden of Eden. Okay, he goes home. That night, that Sabbath night, the Chozeh has a dream. And in his dream, the angels come to him really angry. He says, that guy gave your wife 5 pennies to buy the candles, but she blessed him that his soul should touch the Garden of Eden. He doesn't deserve it. So, what are you doing? You got to tell your wife to control herself. You're not supposed to say things like that. Says, look, my wife is a very spiritual person, and if she said that, I guess she felt something. Give her a chance. Let it happen, let it be fulfilled, and maybe if it doesn't happen, right, so okay. But you know, and he wakes up. Anyhow, after the Sabbath is over, he hears that this fellow all of a sudden sold his business and became different. Why did he sell his business? Because, when your soul touches the Garden of Eden, you feel different all of a sudden. You look at the world different. You start wondering, why am I wasting all my time making money? I have money. Do I need another $1,000, another 1,000 rubles? That's what I need in my life. I need something of meaning. He sold his business, gave half of it to charity, and became a very religious scholar. So that's what, but most of us, we don't have the possibility to touch the Garden of Eden. So we just live our lives the way we do. So we need an inspiration sometimes. That's the story with the Chozeh, the Seer of Lublin. One other story with the Chozeh. This is told, this lady comes to the Seer of Lublin, says, Rabbi, I have a problem. My son is not well. I need you to pray for him. Rabbi says, you can pray too. God listens to everybody. Rabbi, you're special. God's going to listen to me. You're the Chozeh, you're there. Everybody knows you. You've got to pray for him. What's his name? He said his name. Rabbi thinks the Chozeh thinks for a while. The Seer says, okay, that'll be 150 rubles. 150 rubles? Takes me 3 months to pay 150 rubles. Can't just give you that money. I'll be without anything for the next 3 months. Says, unfortunately, that's the price. Things are expensive, 150 rubles. No, that can't be. I can give you 10. Is that 150 rubles I can't pray for? You know what? Forget it. I'm going to pray for myself. And she goes, so his students say, Rosa, you never asked for money for any prayer before. He says, I know, but this lady thinks that only I can pray for her son. Of course I'll pray for him, but I want her to say what she said at the end. That's basically it. I always think they'll do it for us. It doesn't work, they'll do it for us. If you don't do it yourself, it says that the Torah says in Devarim, if you see somebody's donkey falling, you have to pick it up with them, not that they're sitting on the side and you pick it up. If they drop something, you pick it up with them. They also have to be involved. So, same thing. Okay, last story because we're running out of time. This is a story told by Shlomo Carlebach in the 20th century, in the 1960s, but I think it's appropriate because I mentioned the Rebbe of Vishnitz, who was in Bukovina, and so it's closer to home. Even today, Vishnitz is one of the large Hasidic groups in Bnei Brak. That's where their center is. They're probably the largest group today, Vishnitz. Second largest might be Gur. And then you have Chabad, which is actually large, but not that large, actually. So they actually started very small. Okay, so the story goes that Shlomo Carlebach was the Stigig rabbi. He would go from different places in the United States and put performances on of Jewish music and tell stories and teach things. That's what he did from the 1950s until he died in 1996. So the story goes that Shlomo was invited to some small community, Jewish community in Texas. So he arrives there on a Friday morning, and usually he goes to the ritual bath, the mikveh, before the Sabbath. So he called up the local synagogue, and he wanted to know if they have a mikveh. Mikveh is this ritual bath. You go in, it's like rainwater in an enclosed area. So he calls up the synagogue and says, hello, my name is Rabbi Carlebach. I'm visiting here. Does your synagogue have a mikveh? Person online says, a what? No, a mikveh. It's like a ritual bath. One moment, they put him on the line, somebody else. Hello, can I help you? Yeah, I just want to know if your synagogue has a mikveh. Let me ask somebody. Okay, another person says, look, I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want to know, do you have a ritual bath which is called the mikveh or you don't? It's an easy question. Third guy says, actually, we do. It was donated about 12 years ago. Not a lot of people use it, but yeah, come to the office, pick up the key. I'll tell you where you can put it in the post box when you're finished. Okay. So he goes to the office, he picks up the keys for the mikveh, and he goes to the mikveh, finds the building. As he's about to leave the mikveh, he sees this man, looks very Texan, with a cowboy hat and these boots with the spurs, for the horse. coming towards him in a very rough-looking face, coming right at him. And the man looks at him and says, "Is the mikveh open today?" So Shlomo says, "It is now." "Well, do you mind if I use it?" "I don't mind, I'll just stay here." So the man goes in, 20 minutes later, he comes out, says, "Thank you, you can close now." And he says, "What's your story?" "What's my story?" He says, "Oh, you're not from here, right?" He says, "No, I'm just visiting." He says, "Oh, I understand. You're visiting. So you saw I use the mikveh. So you probably assume I'll go to the synagogue tonight. And then I'll have a Sabbath dinner at my house. And you probably want to know if I'll invite you for the Sabbath dinner, right?" No, that wasn't actually my question. I just wanted to know your story." "Story? Okay, I'll tell you my story." It says, I was born in Bukovina, in an area called the Chernaut, and I was between the wars. And when I was a young boy, my father was very fond of the Rabbi of Vishnitz, the Hasidim. We lived far away, so he didn't go very often to visit, but I knew that he was very fond of the Rabbi of Vishnitz. One time, it was a holiday, the Sukkot holiday, the Bus, and he said to me, "Would you like to come see the Rabbi of Vishnitz?" I was like 10 years old. I said, "Yeah, why not? Let's do it." So he took me, and you know what? After the service on a Friday night, they have the teach, which means the table, and the Rebbe sits around the table, and everybody gathers there, and they watch him eat, and he passes the food down the table to everybody. So we come into this long building, and it was like so cramped with people. My father was afraid I'd get hurt. He said, "You go under the table and just stay there. When it's over, you'll come out." Okay, so I crawled under the table. And I saw under the table, a whole kingdom of children were also under the table. So I crawled all the way to the front, right to where the Rebbe was sitting, and that's where I found a little spot. So then they started with the kiddush, the blessing on the wine, and it was given over the table and under the table, and then the challah, the bread, over the table, under the table, and then everything in the part of the meal was the masa was given over the table and under the table. And then at one point, the rabbi started to speak, and he gave a speech in Yiddish. So he said, I of course spoke Yiddish, but I didn't understand anything he was saying. I was just 10 years old. And then at one point, the rabbi stopped his sermon and he said, "I want to tell you something practical." He says, sometimes a person wants to do something holy, something spiritual. And then the evil inclination says to us, the evil inclination is in our own head. You want to do something holy. You want to do something spiritual. You hypocrite. Like I don't remember what you did last week. Like I don't know what you might do next week. So stop being a hypocrite. Spiritual, religious, holy, come on. So what do you say to the evil inclination when it says that to you? It says, I'll tell you. You say to the evil inclination of yourself, say, I know exactly what you are saying. I know 100%. I admit everything. All I'm asking is 5 minutes to be close to God. 5 minutes. Is that too much? That's what you say. So then the Rebbe looked under the table and he saw me. He said, did you understand? I nodded, yes, I understood. That's what I remember. Well, after the war, we came here to the United States. My father got a job in Texas. I grew up here. I can't say I'm the most observant person in the world. But this morning when I got up, I said to him, remembered what the Rebbe said, that sometimes you want just 5 minutes to be close to God. So I thought, what did my father used to do in front? He used to go to the mikveh. So I figured I would do that too. I walked by, I saw the door was open. I came in. Now, you asked me, will I go to the synagogue? I haven't decided yet. Will I do a Sabbath dinner? I haven't decided yet. But in the meantime, I just wanted to do this. So sometimes it's carpe diem. And carpe diem in the Hasidic world is trying to do something holy, even if you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Merci beaucoup. Okay, I will stop this recording.